Hello, everybody, and thank you for attending this webinar today. And to those who will be viewing it at a later date, I'm Lynn Gilman, National President of CHW. And today we have a special guest who has taken time out of her very busy day. Our guest is Dr. Tamar Elram, who is the director of Hadassah Hospital, Mount Scopus. The Mount Scopus campus is the home to the new Gandel Rehabilitation Center, which is transforming care to both soldiers and civilians. CHW has committed support for the large hydrotherapy pool at the new center. The doctor will give us an update on the center, the hydrotherapy pool, and the program, as well as the hospital. Let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Tamar Elram. Before she became the director of Hadassah Mount Scopus in November 2017, Dr. Elram was a senior doctor at Hadassah Hospital, Ein Kerem, deputy director of the hospital, and a lecturer in the adjoining medical school, the assistant to the Health Ministry Director General, and the deputy head doctor for the Mehudet Health Fund in Jerusalem. From 2015 to 2017, she managed Jerusalem's Mizgav Ladash Hospital. In addition to her medical studies at the Hebrew University Hadassah School of Medicine and her internship in women's medicine at Hadassah University Hospital, she also completed her master's degree in public administration from Harvard University in, of course, Cambridge, Massachusetts, in the framework of the Wexner Foundation. Under her direction, she has brought Hadassah Hospital, Mount Scopus, to new heights in the forefront of Israeli medicine. She is also very involved in leadership projects, and she is also about to publish, she's a poet, and she's about to publish her second book of poems. Before I turn it over to Dr. Elram, I want to thank her for everything she does at the hospital and for her extremely strong leadership. Dr. Elram.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us in my evening, and I think it's your morning, and I wish you all a great day. Before I jump into the hydrotherapy pool water, I'd like to start with a little bit of background of what we're going through in these trying times for the Jewish people and the state of Israel. Well, on October 7th, Simchat Torah, I woke up in the morning and I was drinking coffee when suddenly I got a phone call from Professor Yoram Weiss, who's the Director General of HMO. He was actually abroad and he told me, open your TV, watch the news. I don't usually, I'm Shomer Shabbat, so I don't usually use the technology on Shabbat, but I opened my phone and I went into the news and I saw what all Israelis saw, which was a whole big mess. None of us knew to begin with what was happening, because when the massacre began, there were just rumors and stories and no one knew facts. Very quickly, I realized I'd better get organized and go to the hospital, because it seemed that this was going to be a very difficult situation and that the hospital was going to be involved. The only person who left the house that morning before I did was my 24-year-old son, Malachi, who he's in regular days he's a university student, but he was called to reserve duty immediately in an elite unit, which thank God he came home from safely about a month ago and went back to university. So he left and then I left, and I had this feeling in my heart. I wasn't around in the Yom Kippur War, but I've heard many stories about people who hugged their loved ones, who left to the army, and then thinking, maybe we won't see them again. And when I hugged my son and he left, that was the thought that crossed my mind. Who knows what's going to happen? Will there be a war? What's going to happen with the state of Israel? That's how worried we were, how mixed up we were. Really, none of us knew what was happening. It was those first days were really terrible for all of us. So I went to the hospital, and as a leader, it's very important to take a few quiet minutes and remind yourself what your role is in times of uncertainty and emergency. You always have to bring hope. It was very difficult right at the beginning, but everyone arrived at the hospital besides those who were taken to reserve duty. We started asking ourselves, what do we have to do? What are we supposed to do? Now, as the management of the hospital, by the way, there's 6 of us in the management, 5 of us are women, and 1 man who was called to reserve duty immediately. So the 5 of us, we have quite a bit of experience in dealing with emergency situations in the hospital, because COVID to other people was a very scary pandemic, but we were actually at the front of the war of COVID as a hospital. So we're good at dealing with emergencies. But this situation, when the uncertainty was so big, specifically for the state of Israel, was even scarier than it was when COVID began. And COVID was very, very scary. So we all collected at the hospital and started asking ourselves, how do we start our emergency response? What do we need to address? How are we going to deal with the situation, including the uncertainty amongst all of the staff? In Hadassah Mount Scopus, there are about 1,200 staff members, of which about 250 were called to reserve duty immediately, and a few hundred more, their spouses or their children were on reserve duty. So everyone was involved. The first thing we thought about and made sure we took care of was the safety of our staff. In order to keep our staff safe, we needed to address 2 different levels. The first level is the physical level. Every building in Israel, specifically public buildings and definitely hospitals, are committed to have safe areas where, in case of emergency or bombing or attacks in the area, you can move your staff and the patients to an area that's sheltered from bombing, fire, attacks, and whatever. Now, I'm sure that you know, Hadassah Mount Scopus is a very old building, the original Hadassah building that was opened in the late 1930s. And a lot of our infrastructure is still 1930s infrastructure. So you can only imagine that it's not very easy for us to create safe enough sheltered areas for 350 patients and about 1,200 staff members in case of bombing in the area. But we'd already done our best because we're well organized for these situations, and we'd managed to create a space for about 50% of our patients and our staff members. And remember that in times of emergency, a lot of the patients go home because you don't have ambulatory services, and the patients who aren't in emergency situations can go home and whatever. Yet we still we knew we didn't have a good enough response in situation of bombing or air raids on the, well, it wouldn't be usually an air raid, but missiles in the area of Jerusalem. So one thing that we had been planning already ahead was that when we opened the rehabilitation center, which obviously I'm going to speak about in length in a few minutes, we decided that the lowest level of the underground parking in rehab is the nickname for rehabilitation, it's much shorter, that the lowest level of the underground parking would be a hospital in time of emergency. And this was a future plan. We were planning that when eventually we finish the building, then we'll have enough funds and budget to also build the emergency hospital in the car park. Little did we know this would become the most important part of the building from October 7th. Because it's very important that you understand the Gandel Rehabilitation building was not ready to be populated on October 7th. We were planning the earliest to populate the first stage in May or June of this year. And we definitely hadn't prioritized the underground emergency hospital. So already on the night of October 7th, Professor Yoram Weiss, Director General, took a very brave decision and decided to immediately prioritize the emergency hospital. And together with our staff, we managed to equip the emergency hospital, but it's not only basic equipment, it's also air conditioning, sewage, bathrooms. We actually turned the building site, it wasn't even a car park yet, in 2.5 weeks. We turned the building site into an emergency hospital with 130 beds. Many people, many missions and many visitors and philanthropists have come to visit us since then. And everyone who walks into this area immediately says, wow, because it's truly amazing what we've managed to do there. And my philosophy is the more prepared we are, the less the chances that we'll need it. So thank God the beds are still covered, the curtains are rolled up, and it's just standing like a museum as it was where we opened it at the end of October. Hopefully we won't need it. And I also know that part of the funds that you collected, the emergency funds, went to help us fund this underground emergency hospital. So first of all, it's the first time I want to thank you personally for being involved in my capability of keeping my staff safe. So that was the first thing, of keeping my staff safe. The second way of keeping the staff safe is one of the big, what in my eyes is probably the biggest challenge in these times, is that every person in the state of Israel, whether Jewish, Muslim, Christian, men, women, Orthodox, secular, everyone was going through, I don't know if necessarily an identity crisis, but definitely significant questions about their identity and beliefs and political views. And things were becoming very, very complicated. And on day one, I realized that my staff were going to go through big crisis with themselves and amongst their peers. And I understood that I was going to have to keep them resilient. I understood this very, very quickly. So one of the first things I did once we got over the technical issues was I contacted a group of people that work with us on spirit and mind and keeping staff resilient. And I said, if you could please send a psychologist, or she was actually a spiritual worker, the next day, first of all, to sit with the management of the hospital, because in order for us to help our staff feel resilient, we need to feel resilient. So we had that meeting the next day, and we made sure that we had professionals come and speak with the staff of all the departments very, very quickly. But this wasn't very easy, because Hadassah hospitals are famous, and rightly they're famous, for the fact that we represent the complex and diverse population of Jerusalem and Israel. We have Jews and Arabs working together, shoulder to shoulder, as a team, best friends, and really saving lives together. And we suddenly found ourselves in a very dire situation where colleagues and friends who were used to being visited to each other's homes and coming to each other's celebrations suddenly found themselves suspicious of each other. You suddenly found yourself wondering what was going through the mind of someone who the day before might have been your best friend, someone who you'd been spending night shifts with maybe for 10 or 15 years, and you suddenly wonder, what are they really thinking about me? And I'm talking on both sides of the map, both Jews and Arabs who suddenly started suspecting each other and becoming more extreme, or wondering if their colleagues had become more extreme. And this caused a very difficult situation amongst some of the staff and had to be addressed very, very quickly. I'm happy to say that almost in all the cases, we managed not only to deal with this difficult situation with the help of professional helpers and through the directors of each, the heads of each of the departments, but not only did we manage to deal with it, but I'm proud to say that in some of the situations, I think the staff are even more cohesive than they were before. We did have to cope, unfortunately, with some public rioting and outbursts of some of our Arab workers over social media. Such a dangerous thing, social media, such an upsetting thing. Anything you write there, just, you can just write whatever you want and it goes all over the place and the whole world can see it. And we had some cases of Hadassah staff writing extremist views, and they obviously are not working at Hadassah anymore. So that's the first challenge. How do I keep my staff safe, physically and mentally? And also, how do I keep people safe when their spouses and their children are out at war? These are just questions I'm putting out there, because these were the challenges that we had to deal with day one. The second thing, after speaking about the staff, when I speak about the emergency response, was dealing with the wounded soldiers, policemen and women and civilians who came to Hadassah. Hadassah in Kerem and Mount Scopus have treated over 600 wounded patients, some brought in by helicopters, some by ambulances. You probably know that the first 48 hours were a disaster, where the two bigger hospitals in the south received most of the patients because no one knew there were going to be thousands. And then there was a terrible overcrowding, and the Ministry of Health had to disperse the patients among all the hospitals. Most of the severely wounded patients come to Hadassah in Kerem, our sister hospital, which is a tertiary medical center. The lightly wounded, or the light to moderate wounded would start at Mount Scopus, but then often they move from campus to campus because it depends which of the services they need, whether they needed a specific orthopedic procedure, whatever. Because HMO is lucky to have the two hospitals, so we work together, obviously, in a cooperation. But the major part of the treatment of the patients in this time of war that takes place in Mount Scopus is at the Gandel Rehabilitation Center. And I'm going to focus on the Gandel Rehabilitation Center by sharing a personal story with you. It's January, just over 5 years ago, when we set the stone. I was very privileged to be at the stone setting ceremony for the new rehabilitation center, Hadassah's new rehabilitation center at Mount Scopus. You've probably heard these figures before, but I'm going to repeat them and say that even long before the war, there was a chronic lack of rehabilitation beds in the state of Israel. Now, Hadassah Mount Scopus is the only rehabilitation center in Jerusalem. When I speak about the population of Jerusalem, I'm speaking about over 1.2 million people in the capital of the state of Israel. So before we opened the Gandel Rehabilitation Center, we had only our historical rehabilitation department in the old campus. It makes me so happy to say the old campus, with 38 beds, which included rehabilitation beds for all the population. By the way, we do not treat children. There's a specific children's pediatric rehabilitation center in Jerusalem called Alin. But youth, grown-ups, and geriatric rehabilitation all together in the 1938 department. Some of the rooms even with 5 patients in, really very hard to deal with. Although, must remember that we still have the best staff. Even when we were in such a difficult and old environment, still our staff were doing the best that you can. But you know, when you walk into a place, and it's small and crowded and old, even if it's clean, already you feel a bit uncomfortable. On the other hand, if you walk into a spacious, healing environment, you already feel better. So as much as our staff were always doing their best, it was very, very difficult in the conditions that we were before we opened the new rehabilitation center. So this one department with the 38 beds really only supplied about 30% of the rehabilitation needs of Greater Jerusalem. And again, I'm talking about before the war. So we at Hadassah have known for decades that there's a big lack of rehabilitation services in Jerusalem, which is why many years ago, the Director Generals of Hadassah have spoke about and started collecting funds to build a new rehabilitation center. But again, it was only 5 years ago when we finally had the stone setting ceremony. Now, those of you who have been here and see the new rehabilitation center, it's really a mind-blowing project. I remember the first meeting that Hadassah International initiated with the Gandel family. First of all, it was the representatives of the Gandel family. They came to Mount Scopus. We had a meeting with them. And, you know, we have meeting with many potential donors, and you never know when you're going to hit the jackpot. And a few weeks later, we were told that there was another meeting. And then that finally we were shortlisted, and the competition was between us and another building. It was actually an educational building in the center of the country. And that was when we realized that this was going to happen. It took the time that it took to finally finalize the very generous donation from the Gandel family. And I think they should be very proud that we're going to name that this beautiful building is named in their name, the Gandel Rehabilitation Center. So let's go into a few details about the Gandel Rehabilitation Center. And I was going to tell you a personal story, which I forgot. Well, I was talking about the fact that the old rehabilitation department was much too small. Now, unfortunately, about 2.5 years ago, my dad passed away. He passed away at Hadassah in Kerem. My sister donated him a kidney, and then there were complications afterwards, and he passed away a few weeks later. And since he passed away, my mom has been trying to think about what she wants to do in my dad's memory. Okay, now remember this story in the background. On one of the first days of the war now, a grandson of a very good friend of theirs, was seriously wounded in Gaza. He's an officer of paratroopers, and they stepped on a mine at which blew up and practically blew him up. He was flown from Gaza to Ichilov Hospital in Tel Aviv. I'll just, in brackets, tell you that the IDF has learned a lot from future experiences in wars, specifically the former Gaza war and the Second Lebanon War, which was about, I think, 17 years ago. And there are many more physicians in the field, physicians and paramedics, and also every medical personnel, or sorry, every military personnel who's in the field gets basic medical training. For example, every combat soldier has a tourniquet in their pocket in order to be able to stop significant bleeding if one of their colleagues is wounded. This has saved many, many lives. So this specific soldier, if there hadn't been medical personnel around him, he definitely wouldn't have survived. And he arrived at Ichilov Hospital. He was intubated for a couple of weeks, seriously wounded in his arms and legs and in his abdomen. And one day my mum called me and she said, listen, I have an idea. If he survives and he's transported to rehabilitation in your hospital, because he lives in Jerusalem, so obviously he should be rehabilitated at Hadassah, then please God, I'll donate a Torah scroll, a Sefer Torah in the name of my late father to rehab. So this is the background of the personal story. Back to the hospital. So we were going to open the rehabilitation center in, like I said, in May, perhaps June. And you know, things take time. Things take time all over the world, but specifically in Israel, things take the time that they take. And when the war broke out, we realized that there were thousands of wounded, to begin with civilians, but then afterwards mainly soldiers, who were going to need rehab. Our personal dream became a national necessity. Our personal dream became a national necessity. And we, the leadership of Hadassah, realized that we have to do the best we can, but really the best we can. We have to drive the world crazy in order to open our rehabilitation center as soon as possible. Not only because we need the better environment, but because we need more beds. We need the facilities. Those of you who have visited our old campus will know exactly what I'm talking about. And it really, there's nothing to compare the old department to the new building. So the leadership of Hadassah managed to get workers, to get equipment, and you can only imagine how complicated things are in times of war, importing things and transporting and workers, because the country's at war, right? And many people are away in Gaza and in the north. But the unbelievable happened. And we promised the state of Israel that we're going to open in January, and we did. And I can tell you, I cried. When the first patients were transported from the old department to the new building, and we had an ambulance and transporting and everything, whatever. Again, you can only imagine how complex it is to start building working processes and make sure everything happens as it should, with no, you know, when you open a new building, usually there's a time where before you populate the building, whether it's a home or a public building, you don't bring the people in immediately. You make sure everything works, the hot water, the air conditioning, the elevators, whatever. And here we had to populate the building before we made sure everything worked. But thank God there were very, very few technical problems on our way, very, very few. So I really, literally there were tears pouring down my cheeks, down my face when we transported the soldiers. I have videos of to begin with, we transported the lightly wounded soldiers, although who had already gone through most of their rehabilitation. So some of them were dancing into the new building, dancing and singing Avenu Shalom Aleichem. It was really one of the most moving moments of my life. What a great privilege for all of us. Rehabilitation. Rehabilitation is such a unique field of medicine. What's unique about rehabilitation is that, first of all, it's a multidisciplinary field. It's not just the physicians and the nurses. It's the physicians, the nurses, the occupational therapists, the physiotherapists, the social workers, the psychologists, the dietitians, the speech therapists, and I hope I haven't forgotten anyone, all working together as a team. It's like an orchestra. It's so unique and it's so beautiful the way they work together. And the second reason the rehabilitation is unique is because when you have someone who's sick, hopefully you're going to help them heal and they'll go back to what they were before. Rehabilitation is different. In rehabilitation, you redefine what their new limits and their capabilities are, and you help the patients reach their new limits. I like calling it, you redefine hope, which is why really rehabilitation is a beautiful and unique field of medicine. And rehabilitation doesn't include only physical rehabilitation. Oh no. Definitely, you cannot ignore the need to rehabilitate the mind, the spirit, and the soul. The psychologists or social workers and psychiatrists in Israel have been working harder than ever before. But in some cases, we decided we couldn't bring in any more soldiers because we didn't have enough psychologists to treat them. And you can't treat only the physical part. It doesn't help. You can't regain hope, and you can't motivate a patient who needs to be rehabilitated if you're not also helping them mentally cope with the new situation they're in. So back to Gandel. So the Gandel building has been open since the beginning of January, but the building is far from being finished. And what it includes now is 2 beautiful departments, each of them with 38 beds, which it means immediately it's double than what we had before. Either single rooms or double rooms. Beautiful. It looks like a hotel. If any of you have been to the Davidson Tower in Kerem, this is even more beautiful. And we also learned from the architectural mistakes there. The wards are built very cleverly with the nurses station in the middle and 3 clusters of rooms around them, and really all the amenities that the patients need. And literally, it looks like a hotel. So that's 1 floor that's open. In the future, please God, and budget coming in, we're going to build another floor with 2 more departments. So eventually we'll have over 140 rehabilitation beds compared to the 38 that we had before. The second thing that opened is the floor of all the physiotherapy, the occupational therapy, and all the other therapies that I mentioned before. Again, in a beautiful area with halls and technology, and everything that was squashed together before inside these tiny rooms is now in beautiful halls overlooking the Dead Sea, and everything's new. And really, the opening of the building allowed us also to advance a lot of technological machines that we have, because there wasn't enough room before. And we also managed, thanks also to you and our friends around the world, to collect a lot of funds in order to improve our technology, and not only the building itself. So that's the second thing that opened. And the third thing that's opened is our hydrotherapy pools. After I speak about our hydrotherapy pools, I'll just let you know what hasn't opened yet, just so that you're familiar with what the whole building is going to look like. Hydrotherapy is a very significant part of healing rehabilitation patients. I, as an OBGYN, I often recommend to my pregnant patients to go swimming. You know that feeling when you go into a swimming pool and immediately you feel more relaxed. Well, if you're pregnant and you're heavy and you go into the water, then you don't feel the weight. But it's not only when you're pregnant or carrying a weight. It's also when you're suffering from any physical and mental ailment. There's something very, very relaxing and healing about water. And it's not just a regular swimming pool. There are 2 beautiful swimming pools. And thank you for being our friends for the big, beautiful half Olympic, semi-Olympic swimming pool. It looks like a spa, okay? Really, it looks, it feels, it smells, it sounds like a spa. There's everything you need around it. And the water is warm. The water is at a specific temperature that's right for the healing. Now, the 2 pools, the bigger one, which thank you to all of you again, and the smaller one, they have a divide between them so that we can use them both at the same time and keep privacy. But each of them has its unique facilities. The pools it's like an underground gym, an underwater gym, because a lot of patients who are suffering from physical disabilities, and that's why they're in the rehabilitation, only when they're in the water can they move their specific limbs, when there's less pressure on them and the water soothes the pain and the joints. So literally there's an underwater gym. One of the pools, actually the smaller pool, but it doesn't matter, it's all in the same area, also has a special floor that goes up and down. Well, the truth is it's going to have a special floor that goes up and down. Because of the war, it hasn't arrived on Holland yet, but it will soon. And that allows for a patient to get into the water when it's shallow, and then the floor goes down. The patient finds him or herself underwater in their wheelchair. Okay, we have special equipment for doing everything underwater, including wheelchairs. Really, seeing is believing. And you hear the sound of the water coming in, you walk in there and immediately you feel better. There's not one person that comes to visit or comes on tour that doesn't say, hey, can I jump into the water? Really, such a special place and one of the stars of our building. The things that we have not yet opened is the daycare. Now, when I speak about daycare, sometimes when we say daycare, we think of a little clinic. No, I want you to understand that we can treat in the full facility when everything's open, 250 daycare patients at once, okay? Daycare patients come twice or three times a week. So we can have 250 patients whom we treat at once, with about 150 coming every day, which is a massive number. And obviously these patients also use the hydrotherapy pool. It's very, very significant part of their treatment. So the daycare is being built now. Hopefully we'll finish it in a couple of months. We also have not yet finalized the entrance building floor, but it's being built now. So unfortunately now we have to walk in from the car park. Remember, we opened the building about 6 months prior to when we were planning on doing it. And the further things that we have yet to be built are the auditoriums, the clinics, some of the offices, the multi-faith prayer room, and the beautiful synagogue, which have not yet been built. Despite that, about 2 months ago, the grandson of my parents' close friends was transferred to rehabilitation in Mount Scopus. He was one of the first patients in the new Gandel building. He was actually still in the old building, and then he was one of the first patients, one of the last patients to be transferred because he was still in this very severe condition. He's doing extremely well. He's now in rehabilitation daycare, and eventually he'll be fine. It's really, you know, somehow when you say miracle, you're minimizing how hard the staff who saved his life and the staff who deal with these patients in rehabilitation, you minimize how much they're doing. And actually what they're doing is amazing. I could say so. It's probably with, you know, with God's help or whatever, but it's not a miracle. It's really a lot of hard work. And I can also promise you that the healing environment, the feeling that the Gandel Rehabilitation Center has created is a significant part of the healing of our wounded soldiers and civilians. And please God, on April 9th, which is the first day of the month of Nisan, we're going to bring into the temporary synagogue in the rehabilitation center, the Torah scroll in the name of my late father. So you're all welcome. I think I've touched a lot of things because I think the title of my talk with you, I called it, you know, emergency response, when I'm talking about the physical and mental situation of our staff, the emergency hospital, dealing with the resilience, treating wounded soldiers and civilians in Hadassah, and rehabilitation, the Gandel Rehabilitation Center, which I really want to ask you all to feel very proud of being part of rehabilitating not only the specific soldiers and civilians, but it's part of rehabilitating our heart, the heart of the Jewish people, of the nation, of the people here in Israel. And I can only thank you in the name of all these people who use these services which you're part of. Thank you, and I'll be happy to answer any questions or relate to any remarks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Elram. It's been a privilege to hear from you today. And it was such a pleasure to meet you when I was in Israel with Lynn Gilman back in January, when Israel was not at a war and times were much easier. And we had the pleasure of seeing the early construction days of the Gandel Rehabilitation Center. And at that time, our board had not yet even finalized our commitment to the large hydrotherapy pool. And we were just, seeing the facilities being built, and what an honor it has been. And I'm speaking on behalf of our board and Lynn to say it's been an honor to know that the project that we selected for funding from CHW was one of the first floors that were opened and is so necessary, for the center and for the rehabilitation treatment process right now. So we feel so honored to be able to provide that initial funding and for such an important project. And I just wanted to let all of our guests know that CHW, through our emergency campaign, up to the end of December 2023, actually transferred to Hadassah Hospital over $1 million US for the underground hospital, for all the emergency needs that Hadassah Hospital needed, both at Encaram and at Mount Scopus, and the Gandel Underground Hospital. So we're very proud of that as well. And I also wanted to bring to everyone's attention that the hydrotherapy pool is a 1.7 million US commitment. And we are so proud that when we launched our campaign on March 1st, we received a very large donation from the Azrieli Foundation towards that 1.7 million commitment. So we're very happy about that and thankful to the Azrieli Foundation for that funding. So there is a couple of questions, and then I know that you have to head out a bit early, so we'll just take a few questions. I did want to ask a question about the new Reut Rehab Center that's planned for Tel Aviv. And there's been a lot in the media about it, and I know that it's going to be many years now before it's fully, built, and it's 450 beds. And I was wondering how that might affect the Gandel rehabilitation, and if that's going to in any way impact anything for Hadassah Hospital.
So thank you for that question. Unfortunately, like in everything else, especially where male leaders are involved, there's a lot of ego. I'm not going to name certain hospitals in Israel who started competing on the number of soldiers they get to rehabilitate by, saying, yeah, come to us, we're the best, it's fun here, whatever. For example, we know of quite a few soldiers whose families live in Jerusalem, and they live in Jerusalem, who went to the center of Israel to be rehabilitated because of all kinds of non-professional reasons, which is a shame, because a significant part of rehabilitation is to have your family close to you and make it easy for them. So part of this so-called competition, I don't see myself in this world in competition with anyone but myself, but this form of leadership, not in Hadassah, created a competition in the media and whatever. Hey, and we're the best and whatever. But guess what? There's enough to go around. Okay, unfortunately, there's still not enough rehabilitation beds. So part of that, like the number that you mentioned, I don't know if there's any basis to that. I do know that the center of Israel, there's rehabilitation in Ichilov, in Sheba, in Beit Levinstein. There's the highest number of beds. In Israel, there's a phrase, it's called the state of Tel Aviv. Okay, the state of Tel Aviv means those that live in Tel Aviv, they have no idea what happens in the rest of the country. If you look at the north, the south, and Jerusalem, you see the number of rehabilitation beds per capita is much, much lower than the center of the country. So do we really need another 450 beds there? No. Is there really going to be another hospital of 450 beds? I'm not so sure, because once it becomes less sexy and fashionable, the funds might go elsewhere. But even if it does open, the Gandel Center, I mean, the beds in Jerusalem, we need the beds in Jerusalem, and we need the extra floor that we haven't opened yet too.
To that point, and to help fill a funding gap that remains to open all the floors of the Gandel Rehabilitation Center, aside from private funding, from donations of individuals and foundations, has the government released more funds or expedited more funds because of the
Yes.
urgent needs?
Yes, the answer is yes. Professor Elram promised, he personally promised that we'd open in January, and the state committed to giving us, I'm not going to state the numbers because I'm not familiar exactly, okay, but quite a large amount of money that helped us finish it, helped us finish the first stage of the building. Yes, they've definitely chipped in because of the emergency situation.
That's great. Is there anything that's unique about the Gandel Rehabilitation Center and the hydrotherapy project that makes it special aside from the wonderful staff, and I know they're so special in the care, but is there anything that's unique or state of the art in terms of rehabilitation medicine that the hospital is offering?
Okay, so there are two things that are unique. One is that we really have the best technology in the country. There's some special equipment, and we're the only hospital that has. And the second thing that's unique is that we haven't opened it yet, but one of the next projects that we want to open later on in the hospital is a research technological hub where patients are going to be able to receive personally fitted technologies in order to help their specific handicaps that they're suffering from. So instead of the research going outside, we're going to have technological companies come inside and help develop new technologies. The hydrotherapy, first of all, it's the most beautiful hydrotherapy pool that I've ever seen. I'm not an expert in rehabilitation, though I'm familiar with other rehabilitation centers in the country. There's nothing like it. And again, I wish all the rehabilitation centers in Israel to be just as good. But currently, we're with the most technologically advanced, and you know that most of the medicine in Israel is, I think, similar to Canada. It's funded by the state, right? It's publicly funded. So when it comes to creating an environment like this, it really takes a lot of funding, and and hospitalization of a patient in rehabilitation doesn't necessarily cover the expense, which is why I'm saying again, I doubt very much that when the war ends and then there's not, please God, there's not such an influx of number of soldiers being wounded, I doubt very much that the other hospitals are going to keep on, you know, trying to be state of the art, because it's not going to be important enough for them. We realized this already years ago, that we have to be the best, even though it's not necessarily, you know, financially the best thing for a hospital to do, but we're here to give medicine and not to make money.
Is I'm hearing numbers of like 10,000 injured across the country overall, not just soldiers, but you know, and I'm sure those numbers probably include those suffering with mental health injuries, PTSD, etc. Across the country, will there be enough rehabilitation beds? Can Israel meet these needs, or is this going to be a challenge?
It's going to be a challenge. You know, it depends who you ask. I think if it's run properly, then the answer is yes, because most of the patients now need daycare, and daycare services can be more, what's the word I'm looking for? It's easier to play around with daycare, right? Can be more accessible. Unfortunately, I cannot necessarily put my trust in the Ministry of Health to run things properly, again, because of ego reasons and whatever. I do trust Hadassah. We are definitely going to maximize the services that we give, but we really have to finish the building because, for example, now, because we haven't yet built the areas of the outpatient clinics, so we use some of the daycare, some of the physiotherapy and daycare rooms for clinics, which means that we're limited in number of physiotherapy patients. Okay, so in order to maximize the use of the building, we really want to finish, you know, the whole area of the ambulatory services. And even when, please God, the influx of patients slows down back to a normal rate, we're committed to finish this building because we were planning it to begin with, and then just the war landed as we opened the building.
how long are typical treatments? I know everyone's conditions are different, and it's hard to comment on that. So it's a two-part question. How long are the treatments typically for a patient so that they can go live their lives as they did before? That's the first part of the question. And what are the common injuries that you're seeing right now?
Okay, so first of all, they don't necessarily go back to what their lives were before. Often it's to rehabilitate them in order to be able to live in a wheelchair, and how they're going to work, how they're going to, you know, dress their kids if their arms are wounded, how they're going to use a washing machine and whatever. That's rehabilitation is very practical field of medicine. Okay, an average stay for those who are hospitalized is between 6 weeks and 3 months. Okay, again, it depends, and almost 100% of these patients will continue afterwards in daycare. Some patients start to begin with in daycare. Now I've forgotten what the second or third
just some of the more common injuries that you're seeing.
Oh,
like
yes, thank you. Yeah, we're seeing, okay, we're seeing amputations, a lot of limb injuries, a lot of sharp nail in all kinds of places in the bodies, mainly limb injuries, a lot of leg injuries. I think mainly that, yeah.
And then just being mindful of the time, and I do appreciate all the time that you've given us.
Have another meeting in 10 minutes, yeah.
Yeah, so just one last quick question. Is there a hopeful story about a patient that you can share with us that has benefited from either the hydrotherapy or from the Gandel Rehabilitation Center? Is there a story you can
First of all, I think my story about Yair, who's my parents' friend's grandson, is a very hopeful story. There are a lot of hopeful stories. There's a specific patient who he touched my heart. His name is Shlomo, and he's actually a brother of one of the surgeons in Hadassah. And I was walking a lot around rehab, the old rehab and then the new rehab, and there was something very moving about him. And at the beginning, he was seriously wounded in his arm and his legs, and he told a very moving story. He's a medic in the army on reserve duty. He's about 25 or something, a bit older perhaps, in his late 20s. And he described the situation. I was speaking to him once, or he was talking to a group, and he described when the bomb blew up around him in Gaza, and he flew and landed. He said to himself, "Oh my God, I'm dead." Okay, and then he said to himself, "Oh, not only am I not dead, I'm also a medic, and I should know what to do." So he clicked into what, and he started treating the people around him, not even realizing how severely he was wounded. So when I saw him the first time in rehab, what touched my heart most was how obviously depressed he was. Even though physically the doctors told me he was doing well and he'd be okay and whatever. So he was already in rehab a few good weeks before we moved into the Gandel building. And then the day we moved, he was already doing much better. And I have him on a video dancing in. He's the one I'm talking about, and singing Hebenu Shalom Aleichem and Hava Nagila. And it really gives me goosebumps and tears, and it makes me teary-eyed. And he's like smiling and he's happy. So, and I saw in front of my eyes how not only was he regaining his physical strength, but also his mental strength. A few weeks later, I met him again there, and he was just about to go home. And he told me how apprehensive he was about going home and how difficult it was and whatever, and I was giving him hope. And I met his brother today. Like I said, his brother's a surgeon actually in Kerem, and I was in Kerem. Actually, I'm in Kerem now also. I actually forgot I'm here, not in Scopus right now. And I come here a couple of times a week. And so I just met his brother a couple of hours ago, and I asked him, "Well, how's your brother? How's Shlomo doing?" And he said he's doing great, and he's happy, and he's going back to work soon. So, yeah, there's a lot of hope. Rehabilitation equals hope.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for joining us and taking the time to be with us today and share these wonderful stories. It certainly inspires us to continue doing the great work we're doing to raise the money to send to you. So thank you so much on behalf of our donors. Bye-bye. Thank you. And for everyone else on this meeting, I just want to share a couple of last minute notes. We have an event taking place on April 4th in Toronto. It's called Bubkas and Bouquets. We only have 4 spots left. There's limited seating. So if you're interested in participating in this event, please go online to our website and register as soon as possible. And feel free to share the information with those in your network that you think might enjoy it, especially new people who are not familiar with CHW. This was always intended to be an engagement opportunity to expose CHW to new people in Toronto. The other event is Fashion Blooms, which is taking place in Calgary and Toronto on May 23rd. Tickets will go on sale on April 5th, and proceeds will support both the hydrotherapy pool as well as the PTSD treatment at Shamir Medical Center and our local project, Canadian Young Judea, to help promote scholarship funding and programming for at-risk youth who attend their leadership programs and camps. That's all I had to share today. And I just want to thank everyone for joining us, and the recording will be sent out afterwards. So feel free to share it with those that you think might enjoy and learn something about the programs that we're supporting at Hadassah Hospital. So thank you all very much for today, and bye for now.